In the 1980s and early 1990s, the AIDS epidemic swept across the United States, resulting in the vilification of queer people and a large increase in anti-queer propaganda. Faced with the rising death toll and government indifference, the queer community turned to film in an attempt to uplift and empower the marginalized voice of the affected. According to Kubatsky, the popularity of video activism soon gave rise to new queer cinema, a movement of independent filmmakers in the early 90s whose low-budget film acquired high popularity, and whose narratives offered a range of sexual identity and stories. New queer cinema was also heavily influenced by the post-punk movement, a movement that, according to Hart, challenged hegemonic conceptions of ideology and the social order, producing a powerful form of resistance to dominate social group and establishment. The public backlash from the AIDS crisis as well as the post-punk movement built a collective sense of defiance and authority within the queer community that Gregg Araki, a pioneer author of the new queer cinema movement, seeks to represent in his film, with saturated and eccentric visual style, subversion of traditional thematic conventions, and his guerrilla filmmaking style, Araki creates narratives that embrace the vilification of the queer community and establish himself as a pioneer of the queer camp in cinema. The movement has even gone to influence modern queer films like Moonlight, Tangerine, and Perrier. This film, similarly to Gregg Araki's film, illustrates that queer films are more than just discussions of homosexual love. They are tools for giving a voice to socially marginalized groups and carving out space for queer community.
Feelings of desperation and hopelessness were widespread as AIDS seeped its way into the queer community, and these feelings were directly reflected in the pessimism and nihilist themes of The Living End, The Doomed Generation, and Nowhere. At the time, an AIDS diagnosis was synonymous with being handed a death sentence, and Araki stated in an interview with Vulture that he infused The Living End with these feelings of urgency and desperation. John and Luke were both desperate to take their lives and fates into their own hands before their AIDS diagnoses could do it for them. According to Pearl, AIDS is an atypical virus that becomes a part of the body of the infected, essentially becoming an internal struggle, a battle with oneself rather than a battle with a foreign illness. This internal struggle is reflected in Araki's characters continually grappling with their sense of identity, and in the case of The Living End, their body's self-destruction. In The Living End, Luke takes his body's self-destruction and manifests it outward, becoming a criminal and seeking to take his life into his own hands. He asks John to choke him while they have sex, and ultimately places a gun in his mouth with the intention to pull the trigger as he orgasms. The two characters take the disruption of their lives as a result of their diagnoses and use it as an opportunity to do, in Luke's words, whatever the fuck they want. The fear of AIDS and the subsequent othering and disruption of queer people's lives led Araki to adopt strong themes of defiance, reflecting these disruptions and rebellious attitudes through his post-punk filmmaking style and his character's subversion of the mainstream. In his Vulture interview, Araki stated that for The Living End, he used a guerrilla filmmaking style, shooting without permits and using a very small budget, a form of rebellion and defiance in and of itself. Additionally, his protagonist, specifically Luke, existed outside of mainstream expectations, violently killing anyone who stood in his way or dared to mock his queerness. Aaron argued that Araki was unapologetic in his portrayal of queer characters, never shying away from their flaws and immorality. After murdering a convenience store employee and the Doomed Generation, Amy, Jordan, and X go on the run, aimlessly driving and killing anyone that gets in their way. Sexual tension builds between them, and they are eventually attacked by a group of homophobic patriots seeking to rid the world of their sexual deviancy. Similarly, in Nowhere, the characters all experience moments of sexual deviancy and masochism as they navigate their complex relationships with one another and come to terms with their pointless existence. Some characters, like Egg, experience traumatic sexual events, while others, like Bart, play into their deviant desires, but both are ultimately led to feelings of hopelessness and end up graphically committing suicide. Araki's post-punk rage from an AIDS-ridden era was ultimately put on full display in all three of his films. In an interview with Vulture, Araki mentioned the highly politicized nature of the AIDS crisis, describing it as literally being exterminated and targeted for genocide. Araki took these feelings of anger and rage and channeled them into his politically defiant, pointedly non-mainstream films that fought to uplift and humanize marginalized voices while simultaneously forsaking the need for understanding and acceptance from the heteronormative society. While modern films with queer characters have lost this innate rage of the AIDS crisis, remnants of the defiance and alterity left behind are still seen in modern-day queer stories. Films like Moonlight and Tangerine follow their queer characters on their journeys of self-exploration as they navigate their sexual identities in an outwardly hostile and unaccepting environment. Characters break out of societal expectations and ultimately stay true to themselves, rejecting assimilation and heteronormativity, two central concepts to the new queer cinema movement.
Armed with his inspirations from the AIDS crisis as well as his refusal of belonging brought on by the post-punk movement, Araki hallmarked his films with his visual style, which remains consistent throughout his years of filmmaking along with his subversion of genre and his play with character archetypes and objectifications. All of these contributed to his solidification as a cinematic pioneer of unrestrained and unbridled expressions of homosexuality, otherwise known as queer camp. With his growing popularity, these aspects became crazier and demonstrate further his use of queer camp and post-punk to subvert the mainstream. We can see Araki's evolution of strong visual style by first looking at The Living End, one of his earlier films. In this scene, with John and Luke talking, there are pops of neon pink paired with a Smiths poster, thereby showing these pop culture references in a context they are not so commonly found in. By doing so, Araki demonstrates how his choices in filmmaking are meant to remove commonality even from the mainstream. This unique use of visual style is evolved with Doom Generation, where we see the use of distinctive editing with these rapid intercuts between a woman screaming and a boxing match. Such a brazen choice would conventionally be seen as disruptive to an audience's perception. However, given his rebellious roots, such a choice is quite appropriate and consistent with Araki's sentiments. Finally, in Nowhere, Araki's visual style is blown to its campiest proportions in the scene where Bart sits in his room. We see a dramatic display of bright blue lighting and depressing words sprawled across him, which serves as a peek into Araki's expressive mise-en-scène choices and his continued bold visuals. As for Araki's consistent use of character archetype, we can go back to The Living End with a scene where Luke attempts to seduce a reluctant John while he's driving, demonstrating their roles as foils of one another, one being timid and one being a bad boy. This contrast highlights further the sexual deviancy Araki was so fond of, as well as his continued infusion of the post-punk anti-mainstream attitudes into his work. This has progressed in Doom Generation, where X, after losing his original clothes, acquires a new, large belt buckle, which matches his eccentric and unpredictable personality, once again playing into the bad boy archetype, which fits perfectly into Araki's desires to create imperfect queer characters. Nowhere is a demonstration of Araki's fine-tuned character play, as it highlights both Araki's use of character archetype as well as his consistent objectification of men, contrary to what is typically seen in popular media. In this scene, we see Dark and Montgomery in a locker room. However, it is hard to pay attention to what they are saying as the camera is concentrated on their bodies rather than their faces. Araki's auteuristic evolution comes to a head with his consistent subversion of genre. In The Living End, Araki subverts expectations after Luke gets cornered by 3 homophobes. We think Luke is going to get beat up or talk himself out of it, but by having him pull out a gun and immediately kill all 3 of them, we are shocked and shown further how Araki's anger and unorthodox nature can translate into situations of outrage. In Doom Generation, the characters pull up to a gaudy and gimmicky drive-thru with neon green dinosaurs, which serves as a reflection of Araki's negative view of American consumerism and deconstruction of the serene American landscapes often associated with the road movie genre, serving as another example of Araki's ability to flip the standard on its head. Lastly, Nowhere has a dramatic turn of events when an alien explodes out of Montgomery while he and Dark share an intimate moment. The ridiculousness of this moment is a perfect encapsulation of Araki's use of queer camp and his ability to toy with the audience's presumptions. In today's queer cinema sphere, the outrage and camp of Araki's work is not necessarily as prevalent, yet more subtle forms of archetype and expectation subversion can be seen, particularly in Moonlight. In his adulthood, Chiron is made out to be a hardened, traditionally masculine thug, yet he holds great emotion about his past and his gay awakening, both of which are associated with much more feminine qualities.
Despite Araki's tumultuous relationship with the mainstream, he uses his increasing popularity in tandem with his authentic subversiveness and employment of queer camp to further solidify his post-punk auteur style and continues to create a space for queer people outside the bounds of heteronormativity. The AIDS crisis, paired with the bigoted heteronormative society of the 80s and 90s, acted as primary antagonists in all 3 of his films and directly resulted in Araki's defiant, rebellious themes throughout his filmography. As a pioneer of the new queer cinema movement, Araki carved out a space for queer voices, leaving a lasting impact on modern-day queer cinema. While modern-day queer stories no longer have the innate shock value and rage of the queer films during Araki's time, they still showcase the vulnerability and flawed nature of their characters and seek to uplift marginalized voices. In recent years, it's been less about battling a heteronormative society and more so about battling with the majority white queer representation in film. Films like Moonlight, Tangerine, and Pariah are all about uplifting Black queer voices and carving out a space for the Black queer community, further building upon the foundations that Araki and other new queer cinema directors laid out for future generations.